Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to this next week of content. We're on to Module 4 this time, and today we're going to be talking about political issues and political values with special attention to a really important concept that kind of plays foil to what we've been talking about over the last module, and that is the idea of the single issue voter. I know that many of us probably have a lot of assumptions about the fact that these kinds of people are all over the place, people who really care passionately about one specific political issue. They take that all the way from their the morning when they wake up in the morning to the time they go to sleep, and they see sort of the rest of the political world through this lens of whether or not a candidate is going to cater to their specific political issue. So to get started here, I just want to differentiate a little bit between a couple of terms and try to think carefully about what we're talking about here. First of all, the question of what a political issue is kind of something we need to know about before we think about what a single issue voter is. And specifically, I want to consider differentiating political issues from political values. And I think this is a really important topic in the study of public opinion, and one that goes way back to the earliest, public opinion scholarship. Like we've talked about the Michigan School, some of these scholars who were writing about ideologies early in the 1960s and 50s. This early scholarship thought of issues as kind of these specific topics, specific sort of concepts that were nested within these broader umbrellas that we might call value systems. And a lot of these scholars were thinking about value systems, I think, from the perspective of something like a religious attachment. You see a lot of that in the early writing on this subject. They say, think about, for example, religious commitment. Like say that somebody is a Protestant, or even more specifically, some sort of mainline denomination. Like say that they're an Episcopalian or a Presbyterian or a Methodist. What does Methodism, for example, right, have to say about all of these doctrinal, religious questions that lead people to live their lives a certain way, lead people to think certain ways, lead people to worship certain ways, right? All those specific practices and specific sort of tenets and ideas about the interpretation of core religious texts, all of those are ways that we might consider, they're basically issues, right? Those are issues. But the broader sort of sectarian commitment, that's something where we might consider that to be a broader value system. And so issues, as I've said, are kind of these specific positions on, we might call them the decisions, the events, the stuff, political stuff of the day, which again, together are going to inform and be informed by, critically, this broader value system. And so people that have these value systems, again, all their issue positions are going to line up and make sense because they're all being informed by that broader kind of label or idea, right? You're not going to see, again, going back to this sort of religious attachment metaphor, you're not going to see somebody who is like a committed, U.S. Catholic or something, making statements that, like, I don't know who this Pope is, right? I don't think that they're very important. Obviously not, right? Catholics, in general, are going to find the Pope to be much more sort of relevant to their daily lives. They're going to listen to the Pope when the Pope says things, relative to somebody who's like, I'm a Unitarian Universalist. I don't have any, sort of interest in listening to the Pope. Because that's not my religious denomination, right? So those specific sort of issues when it comes down to religious practices, again, fit into this broader umbrella. So too in the world of politics. So, of course, in politics, we don't have religious sects or whatever. Maybe we're getting close, but we don't have these things. We have what we might call ideological attachments. And this is a really important subject, especially to differentiate from party attachments. So we've talked about parties as these sort of institutions that obviously have this elite level where we've got people who, run for office, for example, with party labels. You'll see when you go to vote, we've got the D's and the R's next to people's names. You watch C-SPAN, you'll see that the senators have D's and R's next to their name to indicate that they're members of those parties. In the U.S., of course, we don't have these kind of like card-carrying party memberships as much as might other countries, like in Europe, for example. Really, we have these felt attachments to political parties. And that's, I think, why this distinction gets really confusing for a lot of people. Because ideologies, again, are not these labels that have any affiliation or association with an actual institution, right? There's no, conservative party in the U.S. Like, we have a party system where we have Republicans and Democrats, But in the US, we have these ideological labels that are, again, about ideational attachments to this broader umbrella of worldviews that, generally we, divide, and for better or worse, right, into the liberal and conservative labels. And so there's some really interesting work out there over time that's looked at how people think of themselves as ideological, how people adopt those labels, liberal and conservative, especially as we might think about how people's ideologies, associate or map on to their actual issue positions. And so there's a lot of people out there who call themselves liberal or conservative, but of course there's other labels as well. There's libertarian, there's democratic socialist, there's progressive. There's all kinds of labels that, in some cases do map on to specific party structures. Like I know there is a Libertarian Party of the United States that occasionally runs third-party candidates. Democratic socialists have now like a little bit more organizational structure, at the grassroots level. There's progressives, there's a progressive caucus, for example, in Congress. So these aren't totally devoid of institutional attachments, right? They're aligned with certain institutions, and certain institutions exist to sort of serve some of their overarching goals. But again, ideologies are really just about these broader value systems that are not specific to one partisan vehicle, right? I mean, go back in U.S. history. I think this is why students get this really confused in the modern era, because we think about conservatives being all Republicans and liberals being all Democrats. For most of American history, that's not the case at all, right? We've got both liberal and conservative Democrats, or we've got some liberal Republicans and conservative Republicans as well. It seems antithetical, for many people today, but that is, of course, part of this system. And so really the question for us is, given that we've got these value systems which are themselves distinct from parties and distinct, again, from specific issue positions, we want to know how Americans actually conceive of these labels and conceive of the link between specific issue positions and the value systems that they purport to have. Certainly this early literature, the literature on ideology, the literature on what Americans actually thought and knew about politics in the 1960s, was shocked, and this is one of the foundational findings of public opinion literature. They were shocked to discover that most Americans didn't really understand these values at all. People might call themselves liberal, they might call themselves conservative, but they don't actually map issue positions onto those labels that make any sense. So you've got people who say, "Oh, I'm very conservative," and yet they're, half of their issue positions are sort of arguing for more government, right? Essentially, big government kind of ideas. And then you've got people who say, "I'm really liberal," and then they're, espousing a lot of positions that we would associate with American conservatism. So we've got people who are sort of all over the map in terms of this ideological fit. Even today, this idea that people are unsorted, essentially, in their issue positions. So value systems exist, they're important, but they might not always correlate perfectly with Americans' actual issue positions. That's, I think, one of the first lessons that we can learn when we think about this idea of political values in terms of voting behavior. Because, of course, all of this, people's self-identification and ideologies, and their their choices, essentially, in terms of specific issue positions, those are purportedly, based on the funnel of causality, based on our intuitions, going to matter for who you vote for at the end of the day in an election. I also want to think about the fact that we've got these different issues, right, out there that, again, form or are related in some cases to broader ideological sort of ideas. I want to think about another aspect of this, a subset of the issues that we might call valence issues. And now, again, I'm calling back in this discussion to the last module where we were talking about performance voting, which is specifically about valence issues. Right? Valence issues being essentially things like, how's the economy doing? Are a lot of people, a lot of Americans, becoming casualties in foreign wars? Those are kind of the two big ones, that some of the researchers in the 80s were looking at, especially in the wake of the Vietnam War. Basically, how are things today? The fundamental question of politics is, how have you been? Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And a lot of Americans might make a political choice, not on the basis of complex ideological structures, but just on the meat and potatoes issue of whether or not things are going okay in the country. And so performance voting, as we've seen, is a really important aspect of voting behavior in general. We might differentiate those issues, which we've already talked about, with directional issues, those issues on which it's not clear that everyone agrees that one direction is the best, right? So economy better, most people want that. Economy worse, most people don't want that. However, directional issues like, more access to safe and legal abortion, less access to abortion, right? That's an issue on which there are two poles, and different people are going to move in different directions depending on their ideological proclivities. So directional issues are kind of the rest of politics, besides valence issues. And that's when we think about single issue voters, think about the idea of how are the candidates on the issues. That's what we think about. And so obviously those tie into our ideological considerations, our value considerations. But I want to think about Ronald Inglehart and a couple of other scholars here who have really also thought about, beyond just the liberal-conservative divide and beyond the valence-directional divide, kind of another way to categorize issues as being important determinants of people's votes. And that is the material post-material divide. And I encourage you to take a real close look at that article or that book chapter that I've provided for you, because that's a really, really meaningful distinction here when we're thinking about issue voting in American politics. So this is from Ronald Inglehart's 1977 book, The Silent Revolution. Really a very important and interesting book here for both American and comparative politics, where Inglehart is essentially using this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is sort of a very important concept in social psychology, to think about different issues. And so here we can see that Inglehart's divided material values from post-material values according to essentially this hierarchy. So we see at the very bottom of the hierarchy, that's like the very basics, like food, shelter, things that we need in our daily lives to just feel like we're fulfilling the basics to stay alive. So a stable economy, right? Sustenance needs, essentially. Then above that is safety needs. So obviously we need to feel safe. So defense, crime, and order. All these things are essentially what Maslow, or Inglehart, not Maslow, might call material values, because they're essentially related to the basics, the nuts and bolts of just living life and surviving in a society. However, beyond that, Inglehart identifies sort of this new set of values that you start to think about, you start to care about, once you start moving up that Maslow's hierarchy. And so you can see here that Maslow's hierarchy includes belonging and esteem as part of some of the fundamental needs of a human being, in addition to intellectual and aesthetic needs, which happen at the very top of the hierarchy. And essentially he would argue, Maslow would, that once we've satisfied these things, safety and sustenance, we start to move up the ladder and we start to pay attention to some of these other things. So we think about our culture and we think about our society, and we want to fit in, we want to be liked. Those are important psychological needs for any human. And then as we move even further up from there, we want to be stimulated, essentially. We want to learn something, we want to know something, we want to, again, these aesthetic values, art and culture essentially are the things that truly make life fulfilling. Right? We want to actually be stimulated by something. We don't want to just sit there and eat, our meat and potatoes and think this is good, right? We want to actually engage with the world around us and ask questions of our surroundings. But really that can only take place once we've taken care of the basics. And so these post-material values, Inglehart would argue, start coming in politically as relevant issues once we get past the basics. So essentially, as we start to get richer as countries, and this is of course pretty old data, this is from the 2006 through 8 wave of the World Value Survey, so older than a decade, but still, this is not that old. We can see essentially that there is this curve here, and it's it's a fair correlation. It's not perfect, but there's a fair correlation here between essentially how wealthy your country is. So looking at 1980 data here from the World Bank, essentially how well off is your country? How much, based on surveys, does your country care about these post-material values? Again, looking at post-material values being things like valuing free speech, like wanting more say in government, right? Wanting to, for example, engage in conservation, caring about things like recycling. Recycling is like the, example of a post-material value, because, that doesn't make us any safer or, fulfill our sustenance needs, but it's something that we start to care about once we get past that stage. And so this is, I think, a really interesting observation that beyond just sort of conservative versus liberal kind of values, we also have this other dimension here to issue positions, where essentially voters start to see this stuff as increasingly important as we get more wealthy. And so, some of the wealthiest countries in the world, Switzerland, Canada, Sweden, even the USA, right, is becoming far more post-material in its values over time. And as a result, that's changing the kinds of things that the candidates contest elections on. So I think one thing just to think about when we talk about these broader value systems is that in 2016, there were a lot of questions. A lot of scholars were like, hey, remember that post-material divide thing that we were thinking about in like the 80s, in the 90s? What about Trump, right? Trump is running on a sort of an explicitly like non-post-material campaign, a sort of surprisingly non-post-material campaign. And so Trump is really, again, emphasizing these kinds of meat and potatoes issues like, public safety and, economy, basically. That was kind of the core of his campaign. And so it may be that what was happening there is that Trump was not only appealing to a group of voters that didn't care about post-materialism, perhaps because of the way that they felt in society, right? They maybe felt like their Maslowian needs at the bottom of that spectrum were being underserved, right? Maybe it also meant that Trump was campaigning to his strengths, and he was able to essentially own issues like job creation among these demographics relative to the Democrats, which is a really interesting question and something that I want to take up in the next video now that we've learned a little bit about value systems, is to think about this question of issue ownership and how it might be that one candidate might come to occupy this space and sort of gain a reputation for being good at either some of these material or post-material sort of issue positions, maybe to attract some voters who prioritize those specific issues. So maybe in the quest for the single issue voter, knowing something about the material post-material split, knowing something about liberal and conservative sort of value divides, and now knowing something about issue ownership or the reputation of a party or a candidate on those specific issues is getting us closer to being able to model a real, actual role for these so-called mythical single issue voters. So follow me to the next video and we'll talk a little bit about issue ownership and the role of issues in predicting electoral success.